The first thing she noticed wasn't the cold. The cold had been a constant companion for 2 winters, a phantom limb where her husband used to be. No, the first thing she noticed was the silence. The snow wasn't falling anymore. It was listening. It blanketed the world in a thick, heavy quiet, muffling the memory of laughter and life. Clementine Wade stood on her porch, watching her breath turn to ghosts in the frigid air. Her ranch, once a place of bustling work and shared dreams, was now just a collection of buildings shrinking under a vast, indifferent sky. Beyond the fence, a single crooked pine marked the place where she had buried Elias. The snow had claimed that too, smoothing over the harsh edges of her grief until it was just another white mound in a sea of white. She hadn't cried in a month. The tears had frozen somewhere deep inside her. She was just going out to check on the mare, whose belly was swollen with a new life she wasn't sure she had the strength to welcome. The wind hissed through the barn slats, a cruel whisper that made the animals restless. As she trudged through the deepening drift, her boot hit something that wasn't supposed to be there. It was a hole in the snow. A footprint. Her breath hitched in her throat. The print was huge, deep, pressed into the earth with the weight of a very large man. Then she saw another, and another, spaced impossibly far apart. They weren't from town. No one from town had come out this far since the last condolence visit, their faces a mask of pity she couldn't stand. These tracks led straight toward her barn. A low groan cut through the wind. It wasn't an animal sound, it was human. It was pain. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She didn't call out. She didn't run. She moved with the grim determination of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of hay and fear. The mare snorted, her eyes wide. Something shifted in the deep shadows behind the feed barrels. Clementine's hand, steady and sure, reached up and took the rifle from the nails where it hung. Elias's rifle. She hadn't touched it since the funeral. The metal was cold, unforgiving. Just like her. "Get up," she said, her voice a low rasp. The figure moved, not with a start, but with a slow, agonizing effort, as if he'd been waiting for her. He unfolded from the shadows, rising and rising until his head nearly brushed the rafters. He was immense, broad-shouldered, but he moved like a broken thing. Snow still clung to his matted black hair. His chest heaved, each breath a ragged tear in the silence. He was Apache. His skin was the color of the earth, weathered by sun and brutalized by cold. A dark stain blossomed on his side, a ragged tear in his worn shirt where blood had frozen and thawed and bled anew. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't make a threat. He simply raised one hand, palm out, a gesture of peace that seemed utterly out of place. Then his legs gave out. He staggered, catching himself on a post, his knuckles white. "I mean you no trouble," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper above the howling wind. Clem's finger tightened on the trigger. He saw it. He slowly sank to one knee, his hands now open at his sides in a posture of complete surrender. It was then she saw them, his knuckles, split and raw from the cold, his fingers blue. He wasn't just a threat. He was a man dying. The mare nickered softly, as if vouching for him. He looked at the horse, then back at Clem. His eyes held no fear, only a profound and bottomless exhaustion. "One night," he breathed, the words turning to mist. "Then I go." Her heart throbbed in her ears. The snow pressed against the barn door, a relentless, suffocating weight. She knew the look of suffering. She saw it in her own reflection every morning. But this was different. This wasn't the slow ache of grief. This was the sharp, brutal agony of a man being hunted. She lowered the rifle. Without a word, she grabbed an old horse blanket and tossed it at him. It landed with a soft thud in the hay. "One night," she repeated, her voice hard, trying to convince herself as much as him. He didn't thank her. He just gathered the blanket, his fingers trembling, and wrapped it around his massive shoulders. He settled against the stall, his face a mask of pain. Clem turned and walked back to the house. The image of his surrender burned into her mind. She bolted the door, the sound echoing in the empty rooms. She sat in her husband's rocking chair, listening to the wind, and realized the silence of her home was no longer just empty. It was now occupied by a new and terrifying question. Who was he, and what kind of trouble had followed him here? As she stared into the dying embers of the fire, she noticed something on the floor near where he had knelt. It was small and metallic, gleaming faintly in the dim light. She picked it up. It was a spent shell casing, but it wasn't from a rifle. It was from a pistol, and it was still warm. He hadn't just been surrendering. He had been ready for a fight. But with whom? Sleep was a luxury Clementine hadn't been able to afford for 2 years. Tonight was no different. She sat in the darkness, the cold pistol casing clutched in her hand, every creak of the old farmhouse setting her teeth on edge. The stranger in her barn was armed. He had lied to her with his very first breath. He hadn't just surrendered, he had chosen not to fight her. The distinction was a razor's edge she couldn't stop thinking about. Before the sun had even thought about rising, she was up. She made a small stack of cornbread and a cup of water, her movements stiff and reluctant. She was feeding a stray, she told herself. A dangerous stray. Another part of her whispered back. She left the plate just inside the barn door, not daring to go any further, then retreated to the house to watch from the kitchen window. When the pale, gray light of dawn finally broke, the plate was gone, and so was the blanket. They were sitting just outside the barn door. The plate was clean, and the blanket was folded with a neatness that felt almost military. But the man wasn't gone. He was standing in the snow near the paddock fence, a shovel in his hands. Her shovel. He was clearing a path, not toward the road, not toward escape. He was clearing the path she walked every morning to feed the horses. He moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, his broad back to the house, seemingly oblivious to her gaze. He didn't look for thanks. He just worked. Later that morning, after she'd tended to the animals, she saw he had moved on. He was standing by the crooked pine at the edge of the pasture, her husband's grave. He just stood there for a long time, a dark silhouette against the endless white. He wasn't shoveling. He was just watching, paying respect. How could a total stranger show more reverence for her husband's resting place than the townspeople who had known Elias his whole life? The question unsettled her more than the pistol casing. That night, she left out a bowl of stew. The next morning, it was returned, clean, and the broken latch on the barn's main door, the one that had been dangling since the first big snow, had been mended. It wasn't just fixed, it was reinforced with a small, clever wooden brace she'd never seen before, a design that was both ingenious and strangely familiar. She stood there, her breath pluming in the air, a strange feeling blooming in her chest. It wasn't hope, it wasn't fear, it was confusion. This man, this Apache stranger, moved with a purpose that felt deeply personal. He wasn't just surviving, he was tending to her home. He was fixing the broken pieces of her world, one by one. On the third day, the mystery deepened. She found him not by the barn, but by the woodpile. He had taken her axe and was splitting logs with an efficiency that was mesmerizing, but that wasn't what made her stop dead in her tracks. In his other hand, he held a small piece of wood. He was carving. She watched from the window as he worked, his knife moving with practiced ease. He was carving a bird, a small, detailed mockingbird. Her heart stopped. Elias had loved mockingbirds. He used to say they were the storytellers of the forest, carrying all the other birds' songs. It had been their private joke, their symbol. She had a small, crude one he had carved for her tucked away in her jewelry box. How could this stranger possibly know that? She didn't go outside. She didn't say a word. She just watched as he finished the carving and walked back toward the grave under the pine tree. He gently placed the small wooden bird on the snowy mound of the headstone, then bowed his head for a moment before turning and walking away. The silence that followed was no longer empty or frightening. It was full. It was screaming with questions that had no answers. This man wasn't a stray. He wasn't a simple fugitive. He knew things about her. He knew things about Elias. He was connected to her life in a way that defied all logic. And as the sun set, casting long blue shadows across the snow, a terrifying thought took root in her mind. Maybe his arrival hadn't been an accident at all. The delicate wooden mockingbird sat on her windowsill, a silent testament to the impossible. Every time her gaze fell upon it, a fresh wave of unease washed over her. It was a secret message she couldn't decipher, sent from a man she didn't know, but who clearly knew her. His name was a ghost in the air, his past a locked room. For a week, this strange, silent dance continued. She would leave food on the porch. He would leave a piece of her broken world mended in its place. A leaky spot in the henhouse roof was patched. A wobbly fence post was reset deep in the frozen earth. Her late husband's worn-out work gloves, which she'd left on a railing, appeared the next day with the seams neatly stitched from the inside, the leather conditioned against the cold. He moved around the edges of her property like a phantom caretaker. He never approached the house. He never spoke. But his presence was now woven into the fabric of the ranch. He was a mystery she was beginning to get used to. The town, however, was not. When she rode into town for flour and lamp oil, the whispers followed her like a winter wind. The air in Bellinger's general store was thick with suspicion. "Got yourself some help out there, Clementine," Hank Bellinger said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. He wasn't asking a question. "Just a stray," she said, keeping her voice level. "Storm's been hard on everyone." "That's no stray," a woman chimed in from the back. "Saw him from the road, big fella. Looks like one of them Grey Wolf boys from the territories." The name hung in the air, heavy and dark. Grey Wolf. It sounded like trouble. "You ought to be careful, Clem," Bellinger said, leaning over the counter. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial hiss. "Those men are deserters, fugitives. They say they left a trail of bodies coming out of Wyoming. A man who'll run from the army won't think twice about what he takes from a widow." "I have nothing left to take," she said, her voice colder than the wind outside. She paid for her things and left, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. The ride home was a blur of swirling snow and rising anger. They saw a savage, a threat. She saw a man who respected her husband's grave and fixed her fence. Who were they to judge? Who were they to tell her who to fear? As she approached the ranch, she saw him. He was standing by the main gate, his back to her, looking out at the road she'd just traveled. He must have seen the townspeople watching. He must have known they were talking. When he heard her horse, he didn't turn. He simply stepped aside, melting back toward the barn, giving her space. That night, she did something different. She didn't just leave food. She poured a steaming mug of coffee, the good stuff she'd been saving, and placed it on the top step of her porch. She left the door cracked open and waited. She heard the soft crunch of his boots on the snow. He hesitated on the steps for a long moment. Then he picked up the mug. Through the crack in the door, she saw him bring it to his lips, his eyes closing for a second as the warmth hit him. He drank it slowly, gratefully. When he was done, he placed the clean mug back on the step. Before he turned to leave, he looked at the door. He didn't try to see her, but he knew she was there. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. A thank you. An acknowledgement. It was the first time they had truly communicated. Later that evening, a fierce blizzard rolled in, hammering the house with fists of wind and snow. The old farmhouse groaned under the assault. Suddenly, a terrible sound, like the cracking of a giant bone, echoed from outside. The barn. She grabbed her lantern and plunged into the storm. Inside the barn, the scene was chaos. A massive roof beam, heavy with the weight of a decade of snow, had split. The entire roof was sagging, threatening to collapse on the animals. And in the middle of it all was the stranger. Shirtless in the freezing cold, sweat and snow plastering his hair to his face, he was trying to brace the broken beam with a piece of fence post. It was an impossible task. He was going to be crushed. "You'll kill yourself!" she screamed over the wind. He looked at her, his face grim but resolute. "The roof will kill the horses." He wouldn't give up. For the first time, she stepped fully into his world, into the cold and the danger of the barn. "Then we save it together," she said. They worked for hours, a frantic, silent team. She brought rope, he fashioned a pulley. She held the lantern, he used the axe to wedge new supports into place. They moved as if they'd been working together their whole lives. As dawn approached, exhausted and freezing, they managed to secure the beam. The roof was holding. He stood there, breathing heavily, his body covered in a sheen of sweat and sawdust. For the first time, she saw the full extent of the wound on his side. It wasn't just a rip, it was a brand, a strange, intricate symbol seared into his flesh. It looked like a serpent eating its own tail. Before she could ask, he looked at her, really looked at her. "My name is Dakota," he said, his voice low and gravelly. The name settled in the space between them. Dakota, a name with weight, a name with a past. "They're coming for me," he said, his gaze dropping back to the brand on his side. "The men who did this, they won't stop." Suddenly, the whispers in town, the gray wolf name, the story of bodies in Wyoming, it all felt small and petty. The real danger wasn't the town's prejudice. The real danger was out there, in the storm, and it was hunting him. And now, it was hunting him here, at her home. The sanctuary she had offered a stranger was about to become a battleground. The confession hung in the freezing air of the barn, more chilling than the wind tearing at the walls. "They're coming for me. Not the law, not some small-town posse. The men who did this." His words pointed to a danger far more personal and ruthless. Clementine stared at the ugly, puckered brand on his side, the serpent devouring itself. It was a symbol of something endless, something inescapable. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dakota finally looked away from the brand, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was no fear in them, only a grim certainty. They called themselves the Valhalla Mining Company, but they didn't mine for gold. They mined for men. He told her a story that seemed torn from the pages of a nightmare. Valhalla wasn't a work camp. It was a private prison hidden deep in the Wyoming mountains, run by a sadist, a former army captain who bought native prisoners from corrupt agents and worked them to death. They weren't deserters. They were slaves. "The brand was his mark," Dakota said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "It meant you belonged to him, body and soul, until you were buried in his mountain." Her heart went cold. The whispers in town were wrong, a twisted, funhouse mirror version of a truth more horrific than they could imagine. He wasn't a killer running from the law. He was a survivor running from monsters. "I ran," he continued, his gaze distant. "They lynched a boy, no older than 15, for trying to steal an extra ration of bread. I watched them do it. After that, I knew I would either die fighting or die running. So I ran." "Is that how you were wounded?" she asked, gesturing toward his side. He shook his head. "No, this happened before." He looked back at the house, a strange expression on his face. "There was a guard, an army man, different from the others. He tried to help us. He slipped us food. He treated us like men. He was the one who helped me escape." A knot of dread tightened in Clementine's stomach. "The night I ran, he created a diversion. He fought them so I could get away. They caught him, the captain. He branded him too, right in front of everyone, to make an example of him." Dakota's voice cracked for the first time. "He never made a sound." Clementine felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "That guard," she said, her voice trembling. "Did he have a name?" Dakota finally met her eyes, and in their depths, she saw the reflection of her own grief. "His name was Elias," he said softly. "He told me if I ever made it out, I should find his wife. He said she was strong. He said she lived on a ranch with a crooked pine. He made me promise I would tell her what they did to him. The world tilted. The barn, the snow, the howling wind. It all faded away. Elias. Her Elias. He hadn't died in a riding accident like the official report said. He hadn't been thrown from his horse during a supply run for the army. That was a lie, a neat, tidy lie to cover up a murder. He had been tortured. He had been killed by these monsters. The grief she had held back for 2 years erupted. A raw, guttural sob tore from her throat. She didn't fall. Dakota was there, his strong arms catching her, holding her up as her world collapsed. He held her as she wept, not for the husband she thought she'd lost, but for the hero she had never known. He hadn't stumbled upon her ranch by accident. He had been seeking her out. He had crossed a frozen hellscape, wounded and hunted, to keep a promise to a dead man, to her husband. After the storm of tears had passed, a cold, hard resolve settled in its place. It was rage, pure and clean and righteous. They hadn't just taken her husband. They had tried to erase him. They had tried to bury his courage under a mountain of lies. "What did you do with the men who killed him?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "There was an uprising," Dakota said, his jaw tight. "The night after they killed Elias. We fought back. Many of us died. But we burned that place to the ground. The captain, Thorne, he escaped in the chaos." "And he's the one hunting you," she stated. It wasn't a question. "He wants the only witness silenced," Dakota confirmed. "And he wants something Elias gave me." He reached into a hidden pocket in his worn trousers and pulled out a small, oilskin pouch. He carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal, Elias's journal. "He kept a record," Dakota said. "Names, dates, crimes, everything. It's proof of what Thorne did at Valhalla. This is why he's hunting me. This is what he'll kill to get back." Clementine took the journal, her fingers tracing the familiar tooling on the cover. It was real. This nightmare was real. Her husband's last words were right here, in her hands. The men coming for Dakota weren't just coming for him. They were coming to bury the truth forever. Suddenly, a sound from outside cut through the air. The baying of hounds, loud, aggressive, and getting closer. Dakota's head snapped up, his body instantly tense. "They're here!" He grabbed the rifle from her hands, his movements swift and sure. "Get in the house! Barricade the door!" "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She picked up the axe they had used to brace the beam. It felt heavy and right in her hands. "They won't just be coming for me, Clementine," he said, his eyes boring into hers. "They know who you are. They know this was his home. They're not here to take a prisoner. They're here to erase a memory." The barking grew more frantic, closer now. They weren't just dogs. They sounded like wolves. The ground seemed to vibrate with the pounding of hooves. It wasn't one man. It was a hunting party. And they had finally cornered their prey. The sound was primal. The savage baying of hounds mixed with the thunder of galloping horses. They weren't coming. They were descending. A wave of violence about to crash upon the shores of her quiet, broken life. "To the house," Dakota commanded, his voice a low growl. "Now!" He didn't wait for her to argue. He grabbed her arm and pulled her through the snow, half dragging her toward the farmhouse. The first rider broke through the tree line, a dark figure on a dark horse, a pack of massive, snarling dogs straining at their leashes. More riders followed, fanning out, their forms menacing against the white landscape. They were surrounding the property. They slammed the door shut just as the first dog crashed against it, its claws scrabbling at the wood. Dakota threw the bolt, then shoved a heavy wooden chest in front of it. Clementine ran to the windows, her heart a wild drum against her ribs, the axe clutched tight in her hands. The riders circled the house like vultures, their faces obscured by scarves and low-brimmed hats. They were professional, cold. This wasn't a lynch mob from town. These were the hunters Dakota had described. These were Thorne's men. One of them dismounted. He was a tall, gaunt man with a cruel twist to his lips. He walked slowly toward the porch, his boots crunching in the snow. He didn't look at the house. He looked up at the crooked pine on the hill. "Elias Wade!" the man shouted, his voice carrying on the wind. "Even in death you betray us. Sent a savage to do your dirty work." He spat on the ground. "We know you're in there, Grey Wolf. We know you have the book. The captain sends his regards. He wants his property back, both of you." Clementine felt a surge of ice-cold fury. They were desecrating her husband's memory, twisting his heroism into a crime. "They think Elias was a traitor," she whispered, understanding dawning. "To men like them, honor is treason," Dakota said, moving to the window beside her. He peered through a crack in the curtains. "They've brought enough men to level this place." "Let them try," she said, her voice shaking but hard as iron. She looked at the axe in her hands, then at Elias's rifle in his. This was it, the final stand. Not just for their lives, but for the truth, for her husband's name. The gaunt man on the porch laughed, a thin, ugly sound. "We can do this easy, or we can do this hard. Send out the book and the woman, and the captain might let you walk away." "He's lying," Dakota murmured. "He'll kill us all." "I know," Clementine said. She looked at Dakota, at this man who had endured hell to keep a promise to her husband. A stranger who was now the only ally she had in the world. "What's the plan?" Dakota gave her a look of grim appreciation. "They think we're trapped. They think they have the numbers, but they don't know this land, and they don't know you." He glanced at the hearth. "Is there a root cellar?" She nodded. "Under the floorboards in the pantry." "Good." He moved quickly, his mind working, calculating. "We can't fight them head on. We have to separate them. Use the terrain." He looked from the window toward the barn. The storm weakened that roof, a few well-placed shots. He was formulating a battle plan. Here, in her quiet farmhouse kitchen, this hunted man was transforming into a warrior. Suddenly, a crash of glass from the back of the house. They were breaking in. The dogs were howling, now inside the fence line, clawing at the foundation. "Time to go," Dakota said. He grabbed her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. He pulled her toward the pantry, prying up the floorboards. The smell of damp earth rose from the darkness below. "Wait," she said. She ran to the mantel and grabbed the small, carved mockingbird. She shoved it deep into her pocket, a piece of Elias, a piece of the life they were fighting for. They scrambled down into the cold, dark earth of the root cellar, pulling the floorboards closed over their heads just as the front door of the house splintered and burst open. Heavy boots stomped across the floor above them. Voices shouted, ugly and triumphant. "Find them! Tear this place apart!" They were in the house, her home. They were turning over tables, smashing her life to pieces. Lying in the dark, pressed close to Dakota, Clementine listened to the destruction of her world. But it wasn't fear she felt. It was patience, the patience of a hunter. Dakota put a finger to his lips. He pointed toward a small, grated opening at the far end of the cellar, barely visible in the gloom. It led out to the foundation, hidden beneath a thicket of overgrown rose bushes. An escape route. They thought they had them trapped. They were wrong. The hunt had just begun. But the hunters were about to become the hunted. The darkness of the root cellar was a suffocating cocoon. Above them, the sounds of destruction were a symphony of hate. Glass shattered, wood splintered, and the triumphant shouts of Thorne's men echoed through the floorboards. They were gutting her home, searching for the journal, searching for them. Dakota's hand found hers in the blackness. He gave it a single firm squeeze. Wait. They listened. The sounds of the men's heavy boots moved through the house, from the kitchen to the bedroom where she and Elias had slept. A wave of violation washed over Clementine, so potent it almost made her choke. They were touching her things, desecrating her memories. "They ain't here!" one of the men shouted from upstairs. "The cellar's empty too. Check the barn, the sheds." The gaunt man, their leader, commanded. "Thorne wants that book. Find it, or he'll have your hides." The footsteps thudded toward the broken front door and then faded as the men moved outside. Now, Dakota led the way, crawling on his belly toward the small ventilation grate. The air that trickled in was metallic with the scent of snow and blood from the hounds. He worked at the rusted grate with the tip of his knife, the screech of the metal agonizingly loud in the tense silence. With a final groan, it came loose. They slipped out from under the house, emerging behind a wall of thorny, snow-laden rose bushes. Peering through the branches, they saw the scene. Most of the men were storming the barn, kicking in the doors. 2 were guarding the front of the house, their rifles ready. The gaunt leader stood in the middle of the yard, directing the search, his pack of hounds sniffing frantically at the ground. "They'll find our tracks from the barn," Clementine whispered, her breath frosting in the air. "That's the plan," Dakota whispered back. He pointed toward the deep drift of snow that had piled up against the side of the henhouse. "Stay low. Get to that drift. When I fire, you run. Don't look back. Head for the trees." "Run where? What are you going to do?" "I'm going to give them what they want," he said, his eyes hard as flint. "A target." Before she could protest, he was gone, a shadow moving against other shadows, circling around the back of the property. She was alone. The axe felt pitifully small. Her job was simple: survive. Trust him. She held her breath and crawled, belly down through the snow, the cold seeping into her clothes, numbing her to the bone. She reached the towering snowdrift and burrowed into it, peering out through a small gap. The world was a chaotic stage of armed men and snarling dogs. Then, a shot rang out. It wasn't from the yard, it was from the house. From an upstairs window, Dakota fired Elias's rifle. The shot wasn't aimed at a man, it was aimed at the weakened main beam of the barn roof. The bullet struck the wood with a loud crack. The men inside the barn shouted in alarm. "He's in the house!" the leader screamed, enraged. "Get him!" As the men turned their attention back to the house, Dakota fired again. This time, he hit the other end of the damaged beam. With a tremendous groaning roar, the entire roof of the barn collapsed inward, a cascade of timber, hay, and snow. Screams erupted from within as several of Thorne's men were caught in the collapse. The yard descended into chaos. "Now!" Dakota's voice roared from the house. Clementine didn't hesitate. She burst from the snowdrift and ran, her legs pumping, her lungs burning. She scrambled for the tree line, for the cover of the pines. A few of the men saw her, shouted, and raised their rifles. But Dakota was ready. From the window he laid down covering fire. He wasn't shooting to kill. He was shooting at their feet, at the ground around them, forcing them to take cover, creating the precious seconds she needed. His shots were precise, controlled. He was a soldier. She dove into the trees, the sharp scent of pine needles filling her senses. She risked a look back. The gaunt leader was furious. He ignored the men trapped in the barn. He ignored Clementine. His eyes were locked on the upstairs window. "He's mine!" he snarled, raising his own rifle. Dakota had drawn their leader out. It was a duel. But then, something went wrong. Dakota ducked back from the window as a volley of shots splintered the frame. He had drawn too much fire. He was pinned down. The other men were regrouping, advancing on the house from all sides. The plan had worked, but now he was trapped. Clementine stood in the shadows of the forest, her heart pounding. She could keep running. She could save herself. That's what he had told her to do. But she looked at the axe in her hand. She thought of Elias, dying for a man he barely knew. She thought of Dakota, crossing 100 miles of wilderness to honor a promise. She thought of the mockingbird in her pocket. Running was no longer an option. She turned back toward the fight. She wasn't a warrior. She was a widow with a broken heart and a woodcutting axe. But it was her home, her husband's memory, her fight. She began to move, not away from the gunfire, but alongside it, using the cover of the trees to circle back toward the chaos, her mind racing. Dakota had a plan. Now she needed one too. The forest was her ally. The thick trunks of the ancient pines provided cover, as Clementine circled the battlefield, her mind a whirlwind of terror and tactical thought. The gunfire was concentrated on the house, a relentless barrage pinning Dakota in the second-floor bedroom. Thorne's men were advancing systematically, using the woodpile and the water trough for cover. They were soldiers, not just thugs. They were closing a net. She had one advantage. They didn't know she was still here. They had written her off as a frightened woman, fleeing into the woods. They were wrong. Her eyes scanned the property, looking for a weakness, an opportunity. She saw the horses. The attackers had tethered their mounts near the broken front gate, but one of the men, a younger one, was holding the reins of the leader's black stallion. He was staying out of the direct line of fire, his attention fixed on the drama unfolding at the house. An idea sparked, a wild, desperate idea born of grief and fury. She crept through the undergrowth, moving parallel to the fence line until she was behind the man and the horses. He was nervous, glancing back toward the trees every few seconds. She had to be fast. Taking a deep breath, she clutched the axe and burst from the woods. She didn't scream. She didn't make a sound. She was a wraith of vengeance moving across the snow. The man heard her at the last second, his eyes widening in shock as he turned. She didn't swing the axe at him. She swung it at the leather tethering the other horses to the post. The blade bit deep, severing the reins with a single, clean chop. Then she let out a piercing shriek, a sound torn from the very depths of her soul, and slapped the rump of the nearest horse with the flat of the axe. The effect was instantaneous. The spooked horses screamed and bolted, a stampede of panicked flesh and flying hooves. They tore through the yard, crashing into the men who were advancing on the house, sowing chaos and confusion. The man holding the leader's stallion was knocked off his feet as his own horse reared and galloped away. The tide had turned. The distraction gave Dakota the opening he needed. He burst from the shattered upstairs window, landing on the porch roof below in a shower of glass and splintered wood. He didn't pause. He leaped from the roof, rolling as he hit the ground and coming up firing. He moved with a lethal grace she had never seen, no longer just a soldier, but a force of nature. He wasn't pinned down anymore. He was on the attack. The gaunt leader, his face a mask of disbelief and rage at the chaos she had unleashed, saw Dakota. He raised his rifle, ignoring the stampeding horses, his entire focus narrowing to the man who had cost him so much. Clementine saw it happening. The leader had a clear shot. Dakota was exposed. She ran, axe in hand, straight at the leader's back. He heard her coming. He started to turn, his rifle swinging around. He was faster. He would shoot her before she ever reached him, but he didn't count on the marshal. A shot exploded from the main road, deafeningly close. The leader's hat flew from his head. He staggered back, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had grazed him, his rifle clattering into the snow. Marshal Rand stood there, smoke curling from the barrel of his Winchester. He wasn't alone. Behind him was a posse of a half-dozen deputized townspeople. Hank Bellinger was among them, his face grim, holding a shotgun. "This is not your land, Thorne," the marshal bellowed, his voice the very sound of law and order. "And this is not your law." The gaunt man, Thorne, stared in disbelief. He was caught between Dakota in front and the marshal's posse behind. His men were scattered, fighting off horses or still trapped in the ruined barn. The fight was over. He had lost, but his eyes, full of venomous hate, found Clementine. If he was going down, he was taking a piece of this victory with him. He dove for his fallen rifle. He never made it. Dakota was on him in a flash. He didn't shoot. He kicked the rifle away, and the two men crashed to the ground in a brutal flurry of fists. It wasn't a soldier's fight anymore. It was personal. It was for Elias. It was for every man who had died in the frozen hell of Valhalla. It was over quickly. Dakota rose, breathing heavily, leaving Thorne a broken, bleeding mess in the snow. Silence descended upon the ranch, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded and the nervous whinnying of the scattered horses. The marshal walked forward, his eyes taking in the scene. The collapsed barn, the shattered house, the beaten men. He looked at Dakota, then at Clementine, who stood panting, the blood-stained axe still in her hand. He stopped in front of Dakota and looked at the journal, which had fallen into the snow during the fight. He nudged it with his boot. "Is that the proof?" Dakota nodded. The marshal sighed, a long, weary sound. "I got a telegraph this morning, from a federal judge in Wyoming. He said a U.S. Army sergeant named Elias Wade had sent him a letter, a confession he called it, to be opened in the event of his death." He looked directly at Clementine, his eyes full of a new respect. "Your husband was a brave man, ma'am. He exposed this whole rotten business. The Army is on its way to round up every last man involved. This bounty," he gestured to the groaning Thorn, "is null and void. In fact, he's the wanted one now. Elias had done it. His final act, a dead man's switch, had worked. He had brought the whole corrupt enterprise crashing down from beyond the grave. Clementine's knees finally gave out. She sank into the snow, the axe falling from her numb fingers. The fight was over. The truth was out. Elias was not a traitor. He was a hero. Dakota came to her side. He knelt in front of her, his face bruised, but his eyes clear. He gently took her hand. It was no longer the hand of a stranger. It was the hand of the man who had brought her husband's last words home. The man who had fought beside her to defend their memory. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It was another carving. A perfect, detailed replica of her house. The home they had just defended. The home they had just saved. He pressed it into her palm. "He said you were strong," Dakota whispered. He was right. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in 2 years, they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of pride, of relief, of a strange and powerful love born from ashes and snow. The storm had passed, and in the quiet aftermath, under the watchful gaze of the crooked pine, a new story was just beginning. If you were moved by Clementine and Dakota's fight for justice, and believe that courage can bloom in the coldest of winters, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We have more stories of unexpected heroes and unbreakable spirits coming your way.